Hello, Mr. Haines again. This is now key topic 3 of Cold War. Now we're looking at detente and the end of the Cold War. Well, there's three kind of main points we're going to look at during this video. First being attempts to reduce tension. What did both sides do to kind of end the Cold War quickly? Next, we're going to look at any particular flashpoints that took place between the East and West, in particular looking at the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and then finally the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviet system across Eastern Europe and the fall of the Berlin Wall in October 1989. Okay, let's crack on. Now, by the late 1960s, you get a period where both sides are looking to kind of take a step back from the Cold War. During this time, you have a number of treaties that are signed which are aimed to reduce the tension between the USA and the USSR. Now, this period became known as detente, detente meaning the easing of tensions. Now, from the American side, what happens in the late 1960s is you get a new president in 1968, Richard Nixon. He is elected on the promise of getting the US out of the war in Vietnam, which has been going on since the early 1960s. It cost billions and billions of dollars. Almost 60,000 US soldiers had been killed. And it got to a point where the people were really asking the question, well, why are we still fighting this war? It's going on and on and on. We're not seeing any kind of any benefits. We're not seeing any progress in the conflict. Why are we still there? Now, this had manifested itself into large demonstrations within America about the war, and detente was really a moment for the US to devote more money on their own domestic problems. Now, the policy of detente meant the US would be spending less on money and more taking that money and using it in the right way, so to speak. The Soviet Union as well, they were facing economic problems and they wanted to cut spending on weapons and devote more money to improving the lives of their people and the people in Eastern Europe. Now, the first way in which both sides went about detente was SALT I, which is from 1972. Now, SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Okay, now I'm going to go through a few points here. I'm going to take my time and make sure that you understand exactly the points of SALT I, because this is a really important part potentially of the exam. So you have SALT I signed in 1972, and it successfully limited the number of nuclear weapons both sides had. It imposed limits on the nuclear capability of the US and the USSR. Both sides agreed there would be no production of ballistic missiles. Submarines would only be produced when the nuclear missiles ran out. Why was SALT I significant? Well, it was significant because it was the first agreement between the USA, the USSR, that actually successfully limited the number of nuclear weapons. Now, what's the pros? What's the cons of this SALT I? So you get a slowed down arms race. So no longer are the US and the USSR spending more and more money on arms. You have further kind of negotiations once this is signed. You're more, both sides are more comfortable to get in a room together and just discuss things. And also from signing this treaty, neither side now essentially has a decisive advantage over the other when it comes to nuclear weapons. Both sides are open about their capabilities, and it's clear now that both sides are pretty well matched when it comes to their military. So that's definitely a good thing. On the other side, the treaty doesn't cover intermediate nuclear weapons, which both sides continued to deploy in Europe during the late 1970s. Okay, so that is SALT I. Now, next is the Helsinki Conference in 1975. So again, I'm going to talk through this. It might come up in the exam, so it's really important. So what happened in the Helsinki Conference in 1975? Well, you get the US and the USSR, along with 33 other nations. They make declarations about 3 distinct international issues. Now, these are commonly called the baskets. Okay, really important if this was to come up in the exam. The baskets, the 3 baskets. Now, the 3 baskets are security, cooperation, and human rights. Now, I'm going to go through each of those baskets one at a time. So let's start with security. So the first basket is security. That means a recognition of Europe's borders. Okay, the USSR at this point accepts that West Germany existed and it does not belong to them. Okay, so that is a key issue of the first basket. Okay, the next basket, cooperation. Okay, this basket, there was a need now for closer economical, cultural, scientific links between the superpowers. Okay, and this was hoped that this would lead to closer political agreement. So you could have further talks on certain things. Okay, so that's cooperation. Then finally, human rights. The third basket, human rights. So each superpower agreed to respect their citizens' human rights. Okay, very, very important. Now, why did the Helsinki Conference matter? Okay, so what happened? So what it essentially did was stabilize the situation in Europe. There's less tension now in Europe as there is greater cooperation between the 2 sides. What happened at Helsinki represented essentially the high point of détente. Both sides are incredibly close to each other now. They're working together. So much so that in the same year you get a joint space mission, which is called the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project. That is the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project in 1975. An actual joint space mission between the 2 countries. Now, there's always a however, and here it comes. So, the problem with the Helsinki Conference is that the Soviet Union continued to focus on the Eastern Bloc countries and to apply the Brezhnev Doctrine, which is what we saw in the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And it continued to treat protesters harshly. Now, the US also continued to prioritize its interests in countries it could influence that weren't necessarily under the Soviet sphere of control, places in South America, Chile, El Salvador, places like that. Okay, so that is the Helsinki Conference. Okay, and finally, in 1979, you get SALT II. Okay, so let's remember that acronym. So it's Strategic Arms Limitation Talk. Now, SALT II was an arms controlled agreement that marked the end of détente. Okay, the end of reducing tension. So now tension is going back up again. Relations between the 2 sides are getting worse at this point. Now, the USA, they're very concerned that the Soviets have still got troops in Cuba. They've got about 2,000 troops in Cuba. And as we learned in our last video, the situation in Cuba obviously is very, very sensitive for the US, let's say. Okay, and what happens then in 1979, NATO decides to put to place long-range missiles in Europe. So if you remember at the end of the Cuba section of the last video, we talked about the kind of quid pro quo when it came to missiles. Now that is kind of going backwards. So what is the issues at stake in SALT II? So what both sides want is a limit of 2,400 strategic nuclear delivery vehicles for each side and a limit of 1,320 multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle systems for each side, and a ban on the construction of new land-based ICBM launchers. Okay, really complicated stuff, of course. Okay, so I'll read through it again. is a limit of 2,400 strategic nuclear delivery vehicles, a limit of 1,320 multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, and a ban on the construction of new land-based ICBM launchers. So what both sides are looking for is a limit on the capability. It's not necessarily the bombs themselves, it's the ability to launch the bombs. Okay, that's what both sides are looking to agree at SALT II. But as we said at the beginning, relations are working now, and SALT II is a failure. Okay, Western German politicians, they opposed the treaty as they feared it would weaken the defence of West Germany. You've got to remember, geographically, West Germany is right in the way of the Soviet Union. They are the first and prime target for any invasion of Western Europe. It's going to be West Germany. They thought that after the treaty, the US would be less likely to use nuclear weapons if West Germany was attacked. They actually wanted the US to use their nuclear weapons. Okay, they wanted that security because, like I said, they are in a position that is very, very dangerous. They are very close to being invaded by the member states of the Soviet Union. Some politicians in the US, they also believed that the treaty made too many concessions to the Soviet Union. And then finally, Soviet-US relations, they soured in 1979 due to the invasion of Afghanistan. Okay, this is where we are with SALT II. This is why detent ultimately fails, and we go on to the different flashpoints of the later part of the Cold War. Okay, so detente was well and truly ended in 1979 when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Now, we're going to look at this as we might do a narrative question. So we're going to look at the causes and then the consequences of the invasion to help you when it comes to the exam. So let's look at the causes first. Now, in 1978, a pro-Soviet government, calling itself the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, takes control of the country and it receives economic aid from Moscow. So it's well in the kind of bosom of the Soviet Union. The president of this new republic is called Nur Muhammad Taraki, and he establishes the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Now, not long after, so just about a year after, in September 1979, this government is now toppled by a man called Hafizullah Amin, and he stages what's called a popular coup. At first, Moscow, so the Soviet Union, supports Amin and his coup, but within Afghanistan, Amin becomes very, very unpopular. Okay, his government becomes increasingly unpopular as other pro-Muslim factions try to overthrow him. Okay, so he's not particularly liked by the Muslims in Afghanistan. You have thousands of Afghan Muslims. They join what's called the Mujahideen. This is a movement which proclaim to be on a holy mission for Allah, and they declare jihad or holy war on the supporters of Amin. Okay, so you get a situation where Amin, he's only been in power for a matter of months, but suddenly he's incredibly unpopular with the pro-Muslim factions within Afghanistan. Now, as you can imagine, the leaders of the Soviet Union are particularly worried about this, and the issues within Afghanistan really become quite serious for the Soviet Union. Now, what really pushes the Soviet Union over the edge on this is the fact that they start to hear rumours that Amin, to support him against the Mujahideen, has now potentially been talking to the United States about aid and military support. So it's at this point that the Soviet Unions decide to act. Now, you might be thinking about this and think, well, Afghanistan, Soviet Union, how do these two kind of countries how do they interact with one another? But it's important to remember the size of the Soviet Union is different from other countries around the world. Afghanistan borders the Soviet Union, so you get a scenario where it's almost like a border state, much like Germany is in Europe. It's really significant. So what you have happen is on 24th of December, so Christmas Eve 1979, you get an invasion of Soviet troops into Afghanistan. 50,000 Soviet troops cross the border. They are claiming to be invited in by Amin to support his government against these Mujahideen terrorists. Now, once they're in, a couple of days later, Amin is assassinated and he is replaced by a pro-Soviet leader called Barak Kemal. Now, the Soviets remain in Afghanistan for almost 10 years. They are there essentially fighting the opponents of their man being Barak Kemal. Now, where might you ask, does this fit in with the rest of the Cold War? How does the US react, and why do they react? So first and foremost, the US, they don't really want the Soviet Union to get more control in the Middle East. They don't want the Soviet Union really to get control anywhere. They just want to contain the Soviet Union where they have influence. They don't want their influence to spread. This goes back to the expansion of the Soviet Union after the Second World War. The US doesn't want the Soviet Union to expand. In spite of the relations between the two countries being less paranoid, ultimately, at a very basic level, they don't want them to expand any further. You have an issue with Iran as well, where a successful invasion of Afghanistan might mean Soviet influence in Iran, which has implications for the world oil supply as well. Oil exports from the Straits of Hormuz, really important. Middle Eastern oil is essential to US prosperity. Okay, it's really important. Now, how do they react then? So they're dealing with an invasion from the Soviet Union to protect its interests, a la like the invasion of Czechoslovakia. But the Americans saw this as an example of the Soviet Union working to spread communism, not to protect interests, to actually spread their ideology, which, as I mentioned, 20, 30 years before, the Soviet Union had tried to do across Europe, and now the US are worried that they are trying to do the same into the Middle East. And obviously, bearing in mind the importance of oil to the United States and the key being Iran, this is a really important moment for the US. Now, Jimmy Carter, the US president at this time, he claims the invasion posed the biggest threat to world peace since the end of the World War II. Now, if we think about everything that we've discussed regarding the Cold War, so the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the issue around Cuba, the Berlin Wall, the fact that Carter is claiming this to be the biggest threat to world peace since World War II surely says something about its significance. So what were the consequences then of this invasion? Well, as you can probably imagine, this utterly ends detente, and it makes relations between the two superpowers much worse than they were before. Many Americans felt that now they couldn't trust the Soviet Union. Okay, if you have those, perhaps that 10-year period between the 1972 up to the end of 1979, there was a feeling perhaps that the two countries had almost given up on the Cold War. They'd signed SALT I, they've had the Helsinki Accords, and suddenly now you have a scenario where both countries are mistrustful of one another, and Carter's saying it's the most dangerous threat since World War II. They just can't trust the Soviet Union anymore. So what happens within the Soviet Union? Now, pressure is put on the leadership to end this increasingly unpopular war because more and more troops are dying. Now, I previously mentioned about the US and their kind of preoccupation with Vietnam, and essentially the war in Afghanistan is exactly like that. It is the Soviets' Vietnam. Okay, it's unpopular, people don't understand why they're there, and it just goes on and on and on. Another consequence is SALT 2. As we mentioned, this is not ratified, it's not signed off. And because of that, the US now begin to build up its own stock of nuclear weapons. Okay, they don't see any need to slow down the arms race. The US now are thinking, well, if you're going to invade this country, we're gonna tool up. We're going to be a country that is armed and ready to go. Okay, so you get more and more weapons are produced, and more weapons are deployed in the various bases around the world for the US. The US also stop exporting grain to the USSR, as they had done after the invasion of Cuba. They start to give military and economic aid to the Mujahideen rebels who were actually fighting the Soviet troops, and this now leads to a big change in the United States with the election of Ronald Reagan. Okay, he comes in under the slogan of "Make America Great Again." Where have we heard that before? And Carter now becomes ridiculed as a weak and ineffective individual for allowing the Soviet Union to actually go into Afghanistan. Reagan is seen as very anti-communist. He's seen as a very strong, commander-in-chief. Carter is ridiculed as this weak individual, and it's a big shift, and it's a big shift in mindset when it comes to what the US is going to do with this period of the Cold War. As we see, it really ramps up. It really does ramp up from this moment, from the invasion of Afghanistan, the change of direction by the US. Suddenly you have a real ramping up of the Cold War. So perhaps one of the most famous consequences of the invasion of Afghanistan is the creation of what's known as the Carter Doctrine. Now, in a previous video, we talked about the Truman Doctrine, which was at the end of the Second World War, and tied in with the Marshall Plan, and kind of trying to remake Europe using American finance. Now, in response to the invasion, Carter was so appalled by Soviet aggression, he has stated that the US would no longer necessarily kind of sit back and allow this sort of thing to happen. His stance is basically that the US would use military force if necessary to defend its national interest, even if those interests weren't necessarily within the borders of the United States. So, for example, they could defend their interest in the Persian Gulf. So if they wanted oil from Iran, Carter was essentially saying, if you're going to get in the way of our trade, we will do what we necessarily need to do to make sure that material, that oil, everything else is delivered to where it should be. Okay, that's the kind of hardline approach that Carter was trying to take. But he kind of set out the Carter Doctrine in a number of points. He said that the US would not allow the USSR to gain control of the oil-rich Middle East. Okay, obviously this is an area which is really important to the Americans. He wanted to try and take immediate steps to remove Soviet troops from Afghanistan. Well, as we know, that doesn't really happen. The Soviet troops are there for almost 10 years. He threatened the use of force if the Soviet Union attempted to control the Persian Gulf. Now, this is not really what Carter is like, to be honest. Compared to his immediate successor, Ronald Reagan, Carter is not really known as a man of kind of military action. But this is him trying to assert himself, trying to assert the US. At the end of detente, they're now flipping the coin the other way. They're kind of saying, well, we've had this period where we're not going to be, ramping up our military. Now we're back doing what we've done for the previous 30 years. They also claimed that there would be no trade now with the USSR. Okay, so they wouldn't be exporting grain, as was mentioned, or they wouldn't import any oil from the Soviet Union. Okay. They also said that the US and its allies, so places like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, who secretly provided assistance to the Mujahideen, the US and its allies were directly backing a war against the Soviet Union. And finally, the US ceased cooperating with the Soviet Union and began to confront it instead. Perhaps the most important and well-known aspect of the Carter Doctrine and the consequence of the invasion of Afghanistan is the boycott of the 1980 Olympic Games, which were to be held in Moscow. Okay, now it wasn't just the US that were boycotting the games in face of the invasion. It was actually a US-led boycott of the games in which 60 other nations supported the US. So you have 60 nations that don't go to Moscow for the Olympic Games. Now, you might not think, well, it's only the Olympic Games, but if we've learned anything from history, I think a lot of dictators and a lot of kind of repressive regimes, they thrive on the kind of global events that put a spotlight on their nations, that promote their countries, their way of life. Okay, if you think back to 1936, the Berlin Olympics. Okay, that was a key moment for the Nazis in order for them to prove that they were the master race. Okay, the Soviet Union want to pretty much do the same. They want to promote communism, okay, to a huge television audience. The Olympic Games is a massive, massive deal. The boycott essentially reflects the influence that the US has now on international affairs. Okay, a lot of countries are just going along with the US. Now, it's very controversial. Although a lot of countries, did boycott, all countries looked forward to the games, and they ended up having to tell their athletes, you can't go, and it's a difficult thing for different countries to kind of commit to. However, the boycott is essentially really successful because it does make the Moscow Games look pretty poor by the standards of the age. Okay, star athletes, especially American star athletes, aren't there. If you think about the Olympics, most of your kind of recollection of Olympics or in your popular imagination is of American athletes doing what they do best, winning medals, winning events, world records, all that sort of stuff. Not having the US at an Olympics really makes your games a subpar event. As you can imagine, the Soviet Union, they're extremely angry about this, and they felt undermined, and this makes relations deteriorate even further and actually sparks the Second Cold War, which we'll look at in a minute. As it happens, 4 years later, the US are hosting their own games in Los Angeles. And, as you might already know, the Soviet Union lead a boycott of their own. So in that games, you don't have the Soviet Union, which means not only the Soviet Union, but 15 other communist countries don't go to Los Angeles. So again, you have a watered down event. Now, I don't think that the Soviet boycott of the Los Angeles Games is anywhere near as successful or as important as the boycott in 1980, but it just goes to show how important these events can be, especially when a spotlight is being held not necessarily on the athletes and their achievements, but rather the politics around it all. Okay, so now we get to one of the individuals who are, for many people, certainly in the United States, who is looked at as the man who ended the Cold War, and that man is Ronald Reagan. Now, whether this is true or not is up for debate. I think with history, there's a lot of it's never just about one person. Is my personal opinion. I think there's a number of factors that go into things like this. But it's fair to say that Reagan was elected and as a kind of let's put America back on top. Okay, he didn't necessarily believe that they should be, dancing to the Soviet Union's tune with detente or anything like that. He really believed that, he was the man to kind of make America great again, as he famously said. Now he is elected president in the end of 1980. He takes the role in January 1981. He's elected as he had a tough communist stance, and he actually referred to the Soviet Union as that evil empire. During the campaign for presidency, he was very hard on Jimmy Carter, and he said that Carter had been too soft on the Soviets. Now, Reagan had been a very hardline anti-communist, and he believed that détente actually caused the US to lose ground with the USSR, and he was very clear on that. He had no interest in détente, and he wanted to confront the Soviet Union wherever possible. He made, lots and lots of promises about defense spending, and the US Congress agreed to the majority of his spending, which, if all fulfilled, would cost more than $1 trillion in the years 1981 through to 1987. Now, what he's quite famous for, certainly in Cold War terms, not just being famous for being Ronald Reagan and everything else, is this idea of what's called Star Wars. Not the film, but this initiative called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which was nicknamed Star Wars. Now, the aim of this project was to prevent Soviet nuclear missiles from reaching the US by creating a huge laser shield in space. Okay, hence the name Star Wars. If successful, okay, with this laser shield, it meant that the US would never be victim of the first strike. Okay, it would never be the USSR bombing the US first. Now, whether or not this is possible, we at the time it wasn't really thought possible, but the very idea of it. Now, this is the key thing about the Strategic Defense Initiative. The very idea of it was really important. Okay, now the US had the financial capabilities to even think about something like this, and I think they knew that putting something like this, on the table by even saying, this is what we're gonna do, this ultimately scares the Soviet Union. Okay, the Soviet Union are now really worried that the US is preparing to fight a war with them. Okay, they can see that economically that the US is just well ahead, and they can't really keep up. So around this time, when you've got the invasion of Afghanistan and everything else, the Soviet economy is already experiencing problems, and renewing kind of arms spending might destroy the economy completely. And part of Reagan's plan was that the Soviet Union would try to compete, would come up with something like the Strategic Defense Initiative, in order to save face more than anything. Not necessarily to use the materials, but to save face. Now, remember, America had already won the race to the moon in 1969, and they had been able to develop new spacecraft, the shuttle, in the 1980s. So they are looking more and more like a more technologically advanced society than the Soviet Union. Now, the US is also ahead when it comes to computer technology. During the 1980s, the American computer market had really taken off. Soviet leaders, however, were suspicious and paranoid of computers, because they were concerned how that sort of technology, that sort of information sharing, could undermine the power of the Communist Party. You could potentially use these machines to create anti-communist propaganda. Computers, though, were essential in the modern world, and I think it was a mistake for the Soviet Union to think that they could kind of do without them. It just highlights the point that the Soviet Union really can't compete anymore in the arms race with the United States. Okay, now we're going to talk about a man who, alongside Ronald Reagan, really does deserve to be spoken about as someone that helped bring the Cold War to an end. And that person is Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, Gorbachev comes to power in March 1985, and we really are in the last couple of years of the Cold War. Now, Gorbachev comes in and he really inherits a really bad situation. They're embroiled in this conflict in Afghanistan. The Soviets, they don't really see a way out of that conflict. It's draining the economy. Thousands of Soviet soldiers are dying, and essentially, Gorbachev comes along, and his thing is, okay, I just want to improve the living standard for those people who are living in the USSR. That's his main aim. Now, to do this, he wanted to reform, so essentially to change the USSR's spending, its economy. And he thought the best way to solve any economic problem that existed was essentially to rebuild the economy from scratch. Okay, knock it down and start again. He argued that it was necessary for the government to be a bit more flexible and allow private ownership of property and business. Now, if you remember my first video when we talked about the difference between communist and capitalist, the communist system, everything is run by the state. Everything is run by the government. Okay, there is no private ownership of property or business. Okay, now to achieve this, Gorbachev introduces the twin policies of perestroika, which means economic restructuring, and glasnost, which means openness and free speech. He wanted more openness to halt the constant kind of falsification of the government, of the lies and everything else, and perestroika obviously knocking down that economy and starting again. In addition to this, he wanted the powers of the secret police, the famous KGB, to be limited, and to allow the people, if they so chose, to criticize the government, something they've not really been able to do under the Soviet system. So you're talking about almost 60 years, even before the Second World War. Gorbachev understood that the economy was in a bad way and under immense pressure. And there's the huge investment in military spending, year after year after year after year, completely limited what the government could do for its own people. Okay, it wasn't a society that focused much on its own people. It was a society that focused on its military. It wasn't really focusing on, what can we do to help people. Now, the points that he wanted to go through were as follows. So he wanted to reduce defense spending, obviously, avoid any dangers of nuclear war. He didn't want to interfere with the running of countries outside of their own, outside of the Soviet Union. And most importantly, he realized that the USSR was bankrupt. They had nothing, no money, and they couldn't afford these arms races with the US. They couldn't afford to compete with the Strategic Defense Initiative. Okay, he wanted to withdraw the troops from Afghanistan and reduce the Soviet worldwide aid. Okay, so aid that would go to Soviet communist countries worldwide. And to do this, he sought to reopen that idea of détente, the reduction of tension between the superpowers, and the hope that with reintroduction of détente, that would mean a reduction on spending on defence and the possibility that they might be able to save some money and use that money for their own people. Now, to kind of rubber stamp the fact that Gorbachev was essentially a new kind of Soviet leader, we have another series now of summit meetings between the two nations. So the first one we have is in Geneva in November 1985. Now, although nothing is kind of decided at this, and nothing is kind of like signed off, the Geneva Accord, as it became known, was set out, which committed the US and the Soviet Union to kind of speed up arms talks, to kind of get on with it. Both Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, they kind of promised to meet up in the future, and it was clear that both these men had got on very well with each other. Okay, they'd spoken at length, evidently enjoyed each other's company, and they planned to have more summits. The next one next year in Reykjavik, although they failed to reach an agreement in Reykjavik on arms limitations, there's still evidence that the leaders are now getting on very well. The next one you have in Washington in December 1987. Now, at this point, Gorbachev hasn't quite accepted that the US is not going to go through with their Star Wars initiative, so the Strategic Defense Initiative. Okay, now that is something that the US has promised to scrap. It's not quite happened, but what this does lead to is the signing of the INF Treaty, which is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force. Now, the final meeting is in Malta, and that is in 1989, where Gorbachev now meets the new president. So after 8 years, Ronald Reagan has to step down, and Gorbachev is now meeting with George Bush. No agreement is made at this meeting, but both the US and the Soviet Union see this really as the end of the Cold War. It's around this time that the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan is over. All of the remaining Soviet soldiers have been removed from Afghanistan, and Gorbachev is now pressuring other Soviet countries like Germany, like East Germany, to allow more freedom for the people in East Germany and East Berlin. This obviously leads to more and more freedom, which will eventually lead to the falling of the Berlin Wall, which we'll see in a minute. The Warsaw Pact is also dissolved, and this is replaced with what's known as the Commonwealth of Independent States, with the newly formed Russian Republic as the dominant member. And now we get to the collapse of the Soviet Union. How did it go then from being this all-encompassing kind of conflict for 40 years to suddenly in almost like 4 or 5 years to it just being done, to it being completely over. Now, as with many things like this, it's not necessarily one thing that happens that means that it all ends. It's a gradual thing. Okay, and I do think the election of Gorbachev in 1985 does have a lot to do with it, because he is the one that starts to relax things within the Soviet Union. Okay, he starts to tell those satellite countries that, you know what, you don't have to follow our line anymore. Okay, he essentially starts to say to the people of the Soviet Union that, we're going to give up the Brezhnev doctrine. Okay, so if any country previously had wanted to leave either the Warsaw Pact or the Soviet Union would have gone in with military force, just as they had done in Hungary in 1956 and then in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Okay, suddenly now Gorbachev is saying to those countries, you're now free. You are free to choose how you want to be governed. Okay, they no longer have to fear the wrath of the Soviet Union, the Red Army. They don't have to worry about that. Coupled with this, within the Soviet Union, Gorbachev's reform, okay, so restructuring the economy, perestroika, introducing more government openness to the government, glasnost, okay, that further encourages people within the Soviet Union, within the satellite states, to kind of introduce changes that would improve their standard of living. Okay, increasing people's personal freedoms, allowing them to discuss things, allowing them to criticize, allowing them to have kind of free speech for the first time in 40 years. Now, ironically, Gorbachev was not aiming to end communism. He didn't want to stop the Soviet Union. He wanted to allow it to progress. And he believed that these reforms, glasnost, perestroika, they would allow and strengthen the Soviet governments and allow them to go on into the new century, okay, to allow them to continue, not to end them. The ironic thing being that because of allowing these personal freedoms, allowing the restructuring of economies, okay, that actually led to the Soviet Union dismantling itself, because that's what happened. It dismantles itself over a period of 4 and 5 years. And we know that, you know, the kind of the beating heart of the Cold War, you know, the main point where, you know, everyone's eye is fixated is Berlin. And, you know, if we think about the end of the Cold War, our mind immediately goes back to those images of the Berlin Wall coming down. Okay, that's what we kind of think about in our mind's eye when we think about the end of the Cold War. Okay, so how did it happen in East Germany that this wall that had stood for so many years and had been such a huge symbol of repression and of Soviet control, how did it just kind of fall essentially in one night? Well, as it happens, you know, the East Germans were uber communists. They were really into their communism. They were very slow to embrace these ideas of openness and flexibility. Okay, the East German government even banned Soviet publications of later 1980s because they believed it would undermine the communist system. That's the thing, that East Germans had become over time the biggest communists. Okay, the biggest communists. But as what's happened in the other countries in the Soviet Union, the lure and the desire of these personal freedoms meant that the government was unable to contain the East German yearn for freedom once the other Eastern European states had started to abandon communism. What happened is demonstrations in East Germany took place in 1989, and there were calls for changes to the system of government. Okay, again, Gorbachev's not trying to end communism; he's trying to strengthen it. It just doesn't actually pan out the way he plans. He visits East Germany in 1989 in October, and he informs the political leaders that the Soviet Union is not going to get involved in their internal affairs anymore. Okay, now this leads to demonstrations, and you get on November the 4th, the largest demonstration in East German history takes place, where over 1 million people in East Berlin demand democracy and free elections. Now, what happens that leads to the fall of the wall? Actually, the spark for this is not actually in Germany, it's actually in Hungary. So what you have is Gorbachev, he's announced to East Germany that, you know, we're not going to get involved, and he does it to other countries as well. And in Hungary, as soon as it's announced that, you know, you have a bit more flexibility, elections are announced, and the people of Hungary are like, okay, this is brilliant, okay, and there is a mass movement of East Germans living in Hungary who leave Hungary and go through the border into West Germany. Okay, they're leaving, East Germans leaving Hungary to go into their native West Germany. As a result of this, the East German government, is now being forced to announce even greater freedom to kind of match up with the Hungarians, including for the very first time freedom of travel for East German citizens. It was incredibly difficult for East German citizens to move under the yoke of the Soviet Union. As part of this decision, okay, so this freedom of travel, as part of this decision on the evening of the 9th of November, the East German government announced that the border crossings are going to be open into West Germany. People then start to dismantle the wall, okay, and within a few days, over 1 million people have seized the chance to see relatives, experience life in West Germany, and ultimately it leads to the 3rd of October 1990, where you get the two sides of Germany, East and West, finally being reunited after so many years apart. So with the reuniting of the two sides of Germany, now they're back together, what you get is the end of the Warsaw Pact. That kind of follows really quickly. So let's just think back a little bit. Okay, the Warsaw Pact is established, and it really divides Europe and the world, if you will, into two armed camps. You've got the Warsaw Pact on one side, you've got NATO on the other. Okay, and it's a symbol of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe, and it allowed the Soviet Union to keep an eye on its communist allies. However, the pressure that the events of 1989, the flexibility and the relaxing of the communist government means that suddenly it is impossible for the Warsaw Pact to survive. Without that commitment to communism, to that way of life, the Warsaw Pact has to die. That's essentially what happened. Now, in early 1990, any kind of cooperation between the member states, that is done. And by July 1991, the Warsaw Pact is officially done. Now, the final thing that kind of happens with the end of the Cold War, okay, you got the breakup of the Warsaw Pact. That kind of indicates to the West that communism in Eastern Europe is done. Okay, the Cold War is essentially over with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the relaxation of people's freedoms and everything else in the satellite states. Essentially now the Cold War is done. There are no reasons for the US and the USSR to kind of face each other. One of the armed alliances, the Warsaw Pact, is gone. Okay, NATO is, for want of a better phrase, the last man standing. Okay, you get the satellite states; they begin to get their independence. They no longer have to follow the policy of Moscow, and they don't have to run their economies for the Soviet Union, and they can essentially be free. Now, we know, with the benefit of hindsight, that not all of the ending of communism leads to kind of fantastic life for everybody. Certainly not in those countries. There are issues that remain unresolved even today. Let's just look at the invasion of Ukraine for one example. But I think it goes to show that such a repressive and oppressive kind of system of government couldn't last into the modern age. Okay, people societies now are more in touch with the fact that they need to have personal freedom. You need to be able to express yourself, and communism, as it moved into the 1980s, just wasn't allowing its citizenship to express itself in the way it needed to be. Now, I hope you've enjoyed these 3 videos on the Cold War. I do hope they come in handy for the exams. I will be putting up more, so please subscribe to HAINS-HISTORY.